Hello and welcome to the eOrganic webinar on developing an organic system plan for row crops by Beth Rota in collaboration with the University of Missouri Extension. My name is Alice Formiga and I'm the webinar coordinator for eOrganic. eOrganic is the organic agriculture community of practice with eExtension. You can find all of our published articles, videos, and our many recorded webinars on organic farming and research topics on our website at extension.org/organic_production. Before we begin, I'd like to briefly introduce today's speaker, Beth Rota. There she is. She's worked in sustainable agriculture as an organic inspector, certifier, educator, consultant, and farmhand. Since 2007, Beth has worked for Quality Certification Services, a USDA accredited certifier based in Gainesville, Florida, and she currently serves as an independent consultant for the University of Missouri. She also serves on the board of directors for the Community Garden Coalition, a nonprofit serving community gardens and gardeners in Columbia, Missouri.
Today's webinar is going to cover the major requirements for developing an organic system plan, and we'll pay special attention to row crop production. However, the organic system plan requirements are they're the same regardless of what types of crops are being produced. There's just some special compliance concerns for row crop production that might be different than for other types of crop production. Okay, next slide. If you haven't already done so, I would recommend tuning into the eExtension webinar titled The ABCs of Organic Certification, which was presented by Jim Riddle from the University of Minnesota in 2010. And there's a link to it here. It's on the eExtension website. Today's presentation will touch on some of the same topics as the ABCs of Organic Certification, but we'll go beyond the requirements of the rule to talk about the how-tos of developing an organic system plan in compliance with the standards and submitting it for certification and the certification process. It looks like the slides are advancing on their own, but we'll go with that. So the National Organic Standard, National Organic Standards, also called the National Organic Program Final Rule, resulted from the Organic Food Production Act, which was part of the 1990 Farm Bill. Is the regulation that came out of the legislation. It went into effect on October 21st, 2002, and it's the regulation that regulates the term organic. Who can use the term organic on food and fiber products in the United States. It's administered by the National Organic Program, or NOP for short, which is a program of the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service. I might use the several terms during this presentation, such as the standard, the regulation, or the rule, and all of those terms I'm referring to the NOP standard, the NOP program regulation that governs organic production. Okay. The basic principles of organic production, I'm going to try to go back to that slide. Here we are. The National Organic Standard defines organic as, quote, a production system that is managed in accordance with the Act and regulations, in this part, to respond to site-specific conditions by integrating cultural, biological, and mechanical practices that foster cycling of resources, promote ecological balance, and conserve biodiversity. The way that these objectives in this definition can be met is detailed in the regulation, and that regulation can be found at 7 CFR, and CFR means Code of Federal Regulations, Section 205. And here is a link to that regulation. It's available online, and it'll also say, when you go to the website, it will show you when it was last updated. So it's the most current version of the regulation. All right, getting into the actual certification and the organic system plan development, before you or someone that you're working with decides to create an organic system plan and apply for certification, you'll want to make sure that your operation is in fact eligible for certification. Now, the land where organic crops are grown must have been free of prohibited substances for at least 3 years before the crop is harvested. Any inputs used during that 3-year time frame called the transition period have to be non-synthetic, or if they're synthetic, they must be specifically permitted under the National Organic Program. There are also a few non-synthetic substances, or a few synthetic substances that are allowed, and a few non-synthetic substances that are not allowed, and we'll touch on these in more detail later. And in addition to the 3-year without prohibited substances requirement, the land needs to have buffers to prevent contamination from adjacent conventional production. And under the organic regulations, it is the responsibility of the organic producer to prevent contact with their land and crops from prohibited substances such as synthetic fertilizers, synthetic pesticides, and genetically modified organisms. So this slide here is touching on prohibited practices, and in the upper right corner I wrote the section of the regulations that you can find this information in. In addition to using synthetic substances that are not specifically permitted, there are some practices, other practices that are not allowed in organic production. There are several natural or non-synthetic substances that aren't allowed, such as strychnine, arsenic, and tobacco dust, and those are listed specifically in the regulation. Additionally, treated wood can't be used in contact with organic soil or crops, also not in contact with livestock, and genetically modified organisms, sewage sludge, and ionizing radiation are also prohibited in organic production. So once you determine that your operation meets those requirements, then you can start to develop an organic system plan. And one of the first steps you'll want to take once you've determined that you meet those requirements is finding an organic certifier. There are currently about 50 certifiers in the United States, and they're all accredited through the U.S. Department of Agriculture. How you decide which certifier is right for you depends on your personal preference and factors such as customer service, how long it takes the certifier to do a review of your application, a proximity of the certifier or their inspectors to your operation, the cost of certification, and the certifier's familiarity with your particular crops. You'll also want to ask other producers in your area about their certification experiences, word of mouth for recommendations, because the certifier's website and brochure can only tell you so much. Find out what others like and don't like about different certification agencies. And the link on this slide will show you a list of accredited certifiers through the USDA National Organic Program that you can choose from. And I believe that they are organized by state. And there's not a certifier in every state, but you can use a certifier anywhere. Any certifier that's accredited by the USDA you can use. Okay. When to contact a certifier? It's a good idea to start a relationship with an organic certifier as soon as you know you want to get certified, even if your land is not yet eligible for certification. You'll want to make sure that you're not using prohibited practices during the transition time after conventional inputs were last applied, and certifiers can help you verify that during the transition period. It's also a good idea to send in your application well before you need the certification, so that there's sufficient time to review your organic system plan and conduct the inspection and review the inspection report before your crops are going to be harvested. 4 to 6 months is usually more than sufficient, but it's a good idea to ask the certifier you're working with how long the process will take so that you're sure that you can get your certificate in time. Most certifiers prefer to conduct inspections when crops are actually in the ground, so they can verify that the organic system plan you submitted as your application is actually being practiced. And additionally, some certifiers offer transitional certification. This is outside of the organic certification, and it doesn't affect how your crops can be marketed. They're still conventional, but it can give you peace of mind that your practices are in compliance while you're in the transition period for your land to become eligible. And it's just a piece of paper. It doesn't affect how you can market your crops. Okay. Some operations find it's very helpful to work with a consultant to get certified. Consultants can help you understand the regulations and how they apply to your particular operation. Consultants can help you choose a certifier, and they can also help you develop an organic system plan, complete the application, go through the inspection process, and come up with an appropriate way to keep and manage records. Certifiers can provide valuable information about the requirements of organic production, but they cannot act as consultants or provide any recommendations on how to comply, what types of inputs you should use, what type of production you should do. Consultants, on the other hand, can do that. And oftentimes there's a lot of producers in the country work with consultants, but a lot don't, and you just have to find out if that's right for you. Let's go back one. If you think that working with a consultant is right for you, extension agents and certified producers in your area might help you find a consultant. Also, in some states, the Natural Resource Conservation Service offers assistance with developing a plan to transition to organic production. And so here I have a couple of websites with contact information for organic consultants, and you can refer to that later. Okay, the rest of this presentation will cover the components of the Organic System Plan. The Organic System Plan, in essence, is the blueprint that lays out how an operation will comply with the National Organic Program regulations. The Organic System Plan must be verified and approved by a certifier in order to achieve certification. And fortunately, producers don't need to come up with an Organic System Plan from scratch on their own. All the certifiers have designed their applications to cover everything that is required in the regulation to be part of an Organic System Plan. And the plan covers not just what you've done in the past, but how you operate in the future. And then your certification is based on the implementation of that Organic System Plan. And because your certification is based on your plan, that means that if you're going to change how you do things on your farm, you would need to notify your certifier of making any changes that you make, get approval for those changes, because it's the document on which your certification is based. And once your certification is granted, it can actually be suspended or revoked if you're not following the Organic System Plan that you agreed to with your certifier. So you just want to make sure to work with your certifier, call them, email them if you need to make any types of changes. Okay. All right, so this slide lays out the basic requirements of an organic system plan, and the section of the regulation 7 CFR 205-201 covers each of these points. Every organic producer has to develop an organic system plan that's approved by an accredited certifying agent. It needs to meet the requirements of the National Organic Standard and has to include these 6 things. 1, a description of your production and handling practices. Also a list of inputs used or planned for use in organic production, a description of your monitoring practices, a description of your record-keeping system, a description of how you will prevent commingling of organic and conventional products, and how you will prevent contact of organic products with prohibited substances. And lastly, you'll need to submit any information requested by the certifier that they need to evaluate compliance with the regulation. These are the 6 main components, and we'll discuss each of these in more detail. Typically, as I said, the certifier's application is the organic system plan. However, the regulation notes that you can substitute a plan that you come up with on your own or that you come up with NRCS, provided that it meets all the requirements of the regulation. Okay, let's see. Sorry about the slides jumping back and forth. The first item the regulation requires is a description of your practices and procedures. This description allows the certifier to evaluate compliance with the regulation and includes practices such as tillage and cultivation, how you maintain and improve soil quality, and how you prevent contamination of crops, soil, and water. The plan also must include a description of what crops you will produce and your plans for crop rotation, seed sourcing, cleaning equipment, harvesting, sales, and other applicable activities. I'll touch on a few of these production and handling practices and what's required by the regulation for these practices. And the first one is crop rotation. Crop rotation is a required practice for organic production, and the National Organic Program defines it as the practice of alternating the annual crops grown on a specific field in a planned pattern or sequence in successive crop years, so that crops of the same species or family are not grown repeatedly without interruption on the same field. And cover crops can be used as part of the rotation. So your organic system plan should describe how the crop rotation, it just should describe the crop rotation, what crops are used in the rotation and when, whether you have alternating between growing season and say winter cover crops and successive growing seasons, what different crops you're planting. And it also should briefly describe how you use your crop rotation to manage crop nutrients, soil fertility, how it's used to minimize erosion, and if applicable, to break up pest cycles. So any of those that are applicable, you'll want to include in your organic system plan. Okay, another practice that has to be described in an organic system plan is the sourcing of seeds. If you are using non-organic seeds, including for cover crops, the certifier will need to confirm that it's because the organic seeds are not commercially available in the quantity or quality that you need. Typically, certifiers will want to see that you have checked at least 3 organic seed suppliers before you use non-organic seeds. So you would check for the specific variety that you want, and if they don't have it, then you can use non-organic seeds. Your certifier might ask you to show what seed suppliers you contacted or which catalogs you looked in. And if you use non-organic seeds, the certifier will also need to verify that the seeds you're using are untreated and non-GMO. I've got some resources here for finding organic seed suppliers. ATRA is one. They have an organic seed supplier list on their website. And there's also a new online seed database that can be found at www.organicseedfinder.org. And so those are great sources for looking for organic seeds. All right, moving along, past production and handling practices, the next topic that needs to be covered in your organic system plan is inputs. The organic system plan needs to list all production and handling inputs because your certifier needs to make sure that only allowed substances are in use. This includes fertilizers, compost, pest, disease, or weed control, seed treatments, inoculants, greenhouse production media, and post-harvest sanitizers, or even materials that would be used during crop storage as applicable. Your certifier will need to know the manufacturer of each input as shown on the label, so be sure that your plan includes as much information from the label and as accurately as possible. It's important to remember that the place where you buy inputs is not necessarily the name of the manufacturer. It might just be the store. The certifier will want to know the actual manufacturer. And an example with providing detail is perhaps you have a fertilizer. Don't just give the NPK analysis, give the full name of the fertilizer with the NPK analysis and then the company that made it. If you need to add or change inputs on your plan after you've submitted it to your certifier, it's important to get approval before using new inputs. Even if the new inputs appear to be allowed to you, this helps to make sure you don't accidentally use inputs that are prohibited in organics. And I think this is the most important place where there might be changes in your organic system plan after you've submitted it that can get folks into trouble if you use new inputs that you haven't got approved. I just hate to see it when producers use something and it turns out it had a minor ingredient that isn't allowed, and then they lose their certification for 3 years if it had a prohibited substance in it. So always make sure, if you want to change that, to get approval from your certifier. And I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about the inputs because it's one of the most complicated and also one of the most important parts of the organic system plan. It's really a big part of what differentiates organic production from conventional production is the substances that are used, the inputs that are used in production. So with fertilizers, the certifier needs to make sure that all of the ingredients in your fertilizer are allowed and that any restrictions are met. We discussed earlier that with inputs they have to be all non-synthetic ingredients or synthetic ingredients that are specifically allowed by the regulation. And there's also some restrictions on fertilizers. For example, uncomposted animal manure is restricted if you're growing crops for human consumption. It has to be applied at least 120 days prior to the harvest of the crop, or it has to be applied 90 days prior to the harvest if the crop does not have any contact with soil particles. If you're composting animal manure on your operation, rather than buying pre-composted manure, your plan would also need to have a description of the composting process you're using, and most certifiers also like to see a copy of the composting time, a record of turning the compost, and a record of the temperature that was maintained during the composting process. They don't need to see that usually for every batch, but just to see those records, to see your process and to verify your process. Another example of a restriction on fertilizers is if you're using synthetic micronutrients, your plan should include a copy of the soil or tissue tests that document a deficiency for each synthetic micronutrient you use or that you want to use in organic production. Okay, all inputs used to control pests, weeds, and diseases also need to be listed in your plan. The organic regulations call for a graduated approach to pest control, starting with physical and mechanical control practices. There are some synthetic materials that are specifically allowed in the regulation, but they can only be used when preventative and non-synthetic approaches are deemed ineffective. So your plan would need to show how you document that preventative and non-synthetic approaches are ineffective before you use allowed synthetic substances. Some examples of this would be selecting disease-resistant varieties of a crop, using crop rotations to break pest cycles, and planting crops that attract beneficial insects. And your plan should include a description of all these preventative practices that you employ. Okay, moving on from the inputs part of the organic system plan, the plan also needs to include a description of your monitoring practices and procedures. This would include how you monitor the effectiveness of your soil and crop nutrient practices, such as monitoring your yield, measuring soil organic matter, or taking soil tests. The plan should also show how you monitor for pests, weeds, and diseases, and how you monitor for contamination of crops, soil, and water. The certifier's application will have specific questions about your monitoring practices. Usually they're very easy to just check a couple of boxes. You don't need to come up with a big written approach to it. They'll make it easy and have specific questions with the information that they want to know. And this is true for all of the sections of the organic system plan. The plan requires a description of your record-keeping system, and this is really a crucial component not just of your organic system plan application, but then using that record-keeping system to demonstrate compliance. The plan should show how you're maintaining the records, and then the inspector will use your records to verify that the organic system plan you've submitted is true in practice on your operation. Now, your record-keeping system should be adapted to your specific operation. It needs to fully disclose all activities related to organic crop production and in sufficient detail to show that you're following your organic system plan. And the rule requires that you make those records available for the inspection and maintain them for a minimum of 5 years after they're created. We'll talk a little bit more about records as well. Unless specifically requested, you usually don't need to submit most records to your certifier with your application as part of your organic system plan. You just need to have a description of how you keep the records. But you will need to have the records available for the inspection. And the plan should describe or include a template of how these records are maintained. For example, if you keep fertilizer records on a computer, you would want to submit a copy of that page that you use. It doesn't have to be filled out, but just to show your certifier how you're keeping records. I have a list here of some must-have records that you'll want to make sure you're keeping and have available for inspection. Seed and planting stock sourcing. You'll want to show where you're getting your seeds and where you looked for organic seeds or planting stock. Input purchases. You'll want to keep copies of the invoices and labels for the inputs that you're using, the input applications, the dates of using an input, and the rates of application, how much was used, and where specifically on your farm if you have multiple fields or multiple parcels even. You'll want to keep a record of your preventative pest control practices, a record of cleaning equipment, and this is especially important for equipment that's shared with non-organic production, and I'll touch a little more on that later. You'll also need to have records that show traceability of organic crops from harvest to sales. The inspector is going to want to track that so they can verify that all the organic crops produced on your operation were actually, or that are sold, were actually produced on your operation. And then you'll want to also have records showing the cleaning of transport units. For example, if you hire out a trucking service to get your crops from your farm to the market, some sort of record showing that the truck was cleaned before organic products were put into that truck so they weren't contaminated with non-organic products, non-organic crops, not commingled during the transporting process. Okay. There's a lot of different ways to keep records. Some folks prefer to use a notebook or a calendar where they keep that with them in their truck and just jot notes down on it. Some people use a computer, and some people use both, where they'll jot notes down while they're driving around in their truck or out in the field and then go back home and type it up on a computer. You need to find a system that works best for you. It should be one that you'll use consistently and that will be organized well enough that you can easily find the records the inspector needs during the inspection. I have a website here for you. It's again from ATRA, and it has a publication on record keeping that's for crop producers, and it includes a lot of templates on keeping records. So it can show you a very easy way to document how you source your seeds, a very easy way to document what inputs are applied and where, and it's a really great place to start your record-keeping system. Even if you don't use their templates, it can give you ideas on how to develop your own templates for your own farm. Okay, moving on from records, the plan must also include a description of the management practices and physical barriers established to prevent commingling of organic and non-organic products and to prevent contact of organic land and crops with prohibited substances. And this is essentially called the organic integrity. So you want to make sure that you're explaining how you're making sure that organic crops and conventional crops aren't mixed together, and how you're making sure that conventional inputs either used on a different part of your own farm or on neighboring farms aren't contaminating your organic crops. And the next couple of slides will cover what this means in practice. Okay. Your plan needs to include a description of how you would clean shared production equipment to remove soil, seeds, and harvested crop residue. And this is whether you have conventional production that you also do, or if you're using equipment that's used on another conventional farm, just showing how there's not any commingling of soils, seeds, or harvested crop residues. So you want to include a description of that in your plan. You'll also want to include a description of how you separate organic and conventional season inputs. And this is, of course, of special concern if you're growing crops both organically and conventionally on the same operation. You'll want to show how you're preventing input contamination from shared irrigation systems. If you have a pump and the irrigation system is shared between your organic production and conventional production, and inputs are used through the irrigation system. And then you'll also want to show how you segregate organic crops during and after the harvest if you're also producing conventional crops. If organic production occurs in proximity to conventional production, whether it's your own conventional production or a neighbor, your plan also needs to include a description of the buffers and how they're managed to prevent contamination from conventional inputs and from genetically modified organisms if they're used on adjacent land. The National Organic Program rule does not specify how large buffers need to be, as they're site-specific and based on risk. So if you're unsure of what type or what size of buffer is appropriate for your specific farm, you can talk to your certifier and propose a buffer and ask what they think. Would that be appropriate? Your plan should include a description of where the buffers are. It should show what the adjoining land uses are, and then if there's any features of your buffer, such as a runoff diversion or vegetation, to prevent runoff from a neighboring farm, then that should also be included in your plan. Now, if you harvest crops from the buffer, some farms will do this because there's not a big enough distance between their field and their neighbor's field. They'll have a buffer set up where there's crops grown in that buffer and then are harvested, but then those crops can't be represented as organic. So the plan would need to include a description of how you segregate them so they're not represented as organic, and then how you would clean the equipment used in the buffer before it's used in organic land. And then this adjoining land uses and buffers need to appear in your organic system plan on your farm map. So it's very easy for the certifier to visualize what's going on your operation. And this brings to mind something where the person that you will meet through the certification process is the inspector. However, the inspector doesn't make the certification decision. They just write a report that then goes to the certifier, and they write a report that says yes they do, or yes they, or no they don't follow the organic system plan that was submitted, and then they would write descriptions of anything that they find different from what is submitted in your application. The inspector doesn't actually make a certification decision. It is someone at the certification office who doesn't get to come out to your farm and see things on your farm. And so having as much description of things like buffers as possible is really helpful for the certifier to understand your specific operation. Now, buffers are important, especially with preventing GMO contamination, and this is really important to think about if you're producing row crops that in the conventional marketplace are produced using GMO technology. The method of preventing contamination from GMOs depends on the type of crops you're growing and then the proximity of the GMO crops to your field. For example, if you grow corn, organic corn, in the vicinity of GMO corn, your plan should specify if you prevent contamination with a large buffer. I think that the seed, that for seed varieties to be pure, it has to be 660 feet between different varieties of corn. So that's for preventing GMO contamination, that would be a good way to go. Now, 660 feet would be an enormous buffer, so a lot of producers will also use offset timing of planting GMO corn and organic corn. 2 weeks is usually sufficient if there's an offset in tasseling time. Soybeans generally only need a standard sized buffer, the same for any between organic farm and conventional farm. because soybeans are self-pollinating. The pollen isn't going to drift so far like it does with corn. But the method used for preventing GMO contamination should be described in your organic system plan. And if you want some more specific information about it, eOrganic had a great webinar on the topic, GMO contamination, and it is available at this link here. Okay. In addition to the other topics we covered, your certifier might need additional information. And it might be that something in your application is unclear, or that the inspector noted something of concern, or something that was unclear to them during the inspection. If, when you're going through the certification process, the certifier requests additional information from you, be sure to submit a detailed response. Give as much information as possible in a timely manner. Provide copies of any records that support the answer, the response that you're giving to them when they ask questions. It's always okay to ask your certifier why they're asking for specific information. They should be able to point to the specific section of the regulation that they're using to evaluate compliance. Also, it is essential to notify your certifier of any unexpected events that might affect compliance. This would include natural events such as floods or human errors such as the application of an input that was not on your plan. You'll want to notify your certifier immediately of those because something is going on that's outside of the organic system plan that your certification is based on. Okay. All right, now that we've covered all of the information that needs to be included in your organic system plan, I wanted to just briefly go over the steps to organic certification to give you an idea of the process. So once you've determined that your farm is eligible for organic certification and you have an organic system plan ready to implement it, you can start going through the certification process. And in general, it will follow these basic steps. First, you can request and complete the application from a certifier, and this becomes your organic system plan. The certifying agent will review your plan prior to sending an inspector. At this point, they'll let you know if they need additional information to complete your plan, or if your plan does not appear to comply with the National Organic Standard. I'll give an example of this. If there's an input on your plan that would not be allowed in organic production, the certifier might contact you and ask you if you've used it and where you've used it. And if it's been used on your farm, then the areas where it was used would not be eligible for organic certification. They wouldn't continue the process of doing an inspection if they've determined that it's not compliant at that point. But if it does, if your plan on paper appears to comply with the regulation, they'll send an inspector, and then the inspector will verify that the organic system plan application accurately reflects your practices and that you have records to document the implementation of your plan. After the inspection, then the inspector will write a report that goes back to the certifier, and the certifier will review that report. Again, if there are questions or additional details are needed, the certifier will contact you. If they find that everything is in compliance, they'll issue an organic certificate. Sometimes organic certificates are issued with continuous improvement points that need to be followed up on. They're usually called minor noncompliances. And the certifier will let you know how long you have to correct the minor noncompliances if those are issued. And they'll point to the section of the regulation that, that was not in full compliance. And then lastly, the process is annual. The organic system plan needs to be updated on an annual basis, followed by a yearly inspection. And different certifiers go about this in different ways. Either you fill out the organic system plan application again, or just fill out update pages. So you'll want to check with your certifier about their process for the annual renewal, and they'll usually notify you when it's time to submit your annual renewal of your plan, and you'll want to let them know of any changes that have happened or any changes that you anticipate in the coming 12 months, the coming year. Okay, I've got some links here to additional resources.
Unmuted.
National Organic Program website, eOrganic, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, the National Sustainable Agriculture Information Service, which is a program of ATRA, the Organic Materials Review Institute, and this is an organization that that reviews materials for use in organic production when a company submits it to. It's also called OMRI. They'll submit materials and then become listed, and most of those materials are then accepted by organic certifiers. And then the Organic Seed Finder, which I had previously. And that is it from me, and we can move on to the questions.
Here's a question. What education and experience is required to become a certifying agent? I'm considering this when I retire from federal service as a local need in my area. I currently work with certified and transitioning to organic producers in use of Farm Bill programs to assist them.
That's a very good question. To become a certifier, an actual certifier, you have to go through accreditation with the U.S. Department of Agriculture to be a certification agency. And that information is available in the actual regulation. It's a detailed process where, much like organic producers have to come up with an organic system plan, an organic certifier needs to come up with a quality system, a system with which they use to evaluate plans for compliance, and they become audited. They're audited by the USDA National Organic Program. This isn't an individual thing, it's an agency, an organization. If you want to work for an existing organization, you should check with them specifically about what type of experience they would want you to have. Experience in farming is very useful, or experience working with farmers, or education and outreach. However, in addition to being an actual, working for an actual certification agency, or starting an actual certification agency, there's a lot of folks that work in organic certification as inspectors, and people that work independently as inspectors. Most certification agencies will hire independent inspectors to go out and do inspections that are in their part of the country, so that they're in close proximity to the farms that they're working with. And there is an organization called the it's IOIA, Independent Organic Inspectors Association, and they offer specific training for different scopes, and the scopes are crop production, livestock production, and food processing. And they will offer training for those. And most certifiers will find inspectors that have gone through an IOIA inspector training, and they get a certificate from that training. So that's specific to learning how to do an organic inspection, write an inspection report. But as far as working for a certification agency, you'd want to just contact the certification agency and ask what they would be looking for if they have any openings. As far as developing your own certification agency, the requirements for that is specified in the National Organic Program Regulation 7 CFR 205, and you would work directly with the USDA to do that. I hope that answered your question. It's kind of broad.
Okay, thank you. Here's another question. Can you give some ballpark estimates for the initial and annual costs paid by farm to certifiers, as well as typical consultant fees?
You would really need to talk to the specific certifier for that. The costs of certification depend on a lot of different things. A lot of certifiers have different fee structures. It might depend on the size of your operation, so how many acres you have, or it might depend on the income of your operation, where certifiers will have a sliding scale depending on your income. And as far as consultants, I've seen everything across the board, from a consultant who charges $500 for the whole process, or a consultant that charges $50 an hour for their time. It really varies. I would recommend just contacting different different certification agencies and asking them about their fee structure. They usually have it on their website. This is something I always like to remind people, is that although there are costs to organic certification, you do get what you pay for. The certification agencies that have a more mid-range cost may have more staff that are more prompt at answering questions because they have more staff to go around. So just keep that in mind and get an idea of the customer service, both with the certification agencies and consultants, and don't let cost be the only factor. But most certification is going to be similar. It's going to be similar from certification agency to agency, and I don't want to give a ballpark figure specifically to the cost of certification because it really varies depending on the size of your farm.
Okay, here's a question from someone who is filling out an application. He's asking, what is the Organic Farm Plan Questionnaire, an application that he had asked him to fill out the year when a complete organic farm plan questionnaire was last submitted. You know what that is?
Well, that is probably asking for the last time that you filled out, and it probably just means the application, whether it's through that certification agency or another certification agency. And the reason they're asking you that is if you have applied for organic certification in the past with a different certification agency, the new certifier needs to know about it. And it's because if you were had achieved certification and it was suspended or revoked, that would affect your ability to become certified with another certification agency. Or if it was denied, and that means you didn't ever get certified, they would need to know that. And so that's why they're asking when you last submitted a questionnaire, and that's just a generic term meaning the plan or the application, be it through that organization or with another, a different certifier.
Okay, here's a question from someone who's transitioning. If you move from certified land to land in transition, what steps need to be made, if any, with your certifying agency outside of continuing organic standard?
Anytime you are moving your production to another piece of land, that land itself needs to go through the entire certification process. The certification is not just based on the inputs that you're using, the practices that you're using, but the land itself, the unique features of the land and the unique history of that land. So before, even if you have an organic certificate, if you're moving to a different piece of land, be it land that is in transition or land that has never been farmed before, you need to submit information on that land to your certifier and have it inspected and approved before crops from that land are represented as organic. That's a major change to your organic system plan. Different certifiers might have different ways that they go about that process. The quality certification services who I work with, they would have you submit an additional lands application in which you would say, my practices are the same as what has already been approved, or my practices are different and here are the differences, and then you give information on the history of the land, provide a map, provide information on the buffers. But it's important to remember that that is a major change to an organic system plan, and that land needs to be inspected and certified before any crops from that land can be represented as organic.
Okay, thank you. We got a couple comments from people about the IOIA. It's now called the International Organic Inspector Association. So if you type that into a search engine, you'll be able to find out more about their classes and other services. So going back to the next question, would the requirements for organic certification be the same for hydroponically grown foods?
Yes, the requirements are the same for hydroponically grown crops. The difference is that any crops that are grown in a greenhouse, whether you're using soilless media such as a potting mix or hydroponically, is that you don't have the requirement for the land to be free of prohibited substances for 3 years because you're not actually growing crops in the ground. It would just be that the inputs that you're using, be it the potting mix or hydroponically, the inputs that go into the water would have to be allowed in organic production.
Okay, here's a comment that organic certification seems to be a very time-consuming and potentially costly process. Is there any evidence to show that it makes financial sense for small growers?
I don't actually think that I'm qualified to answer that question, because the experience probably that it would be different depending on the type of production the grower is doing, the type of market they have in their area. And so what I would recommend doing is find other producers that are producing the type of crops that you're producing or serving a similar market, and find out if it's worth it to them, because it would be very different depending on what you're growing, where, and who you're selling to. One way you can do that is by going to the National Organic Program website, and they have a list of certified producers, and it's very interesting. It's searchable, but you can search in a number of different categories on the list, such as their location, or the state or the city that they're in, or also the type of crops they're producing. They might have a list of crops. You could type in apples, for example, and it would bring up a list of apple producers, and so you can get an idea of who's producing in your area, and find their contact information and get in touch with them. It really would be, specific to your market, and whether it would be worth it or not for you and your market.
Okay. So we have a couple questions about farms that are in urban areas and how different things going on in the area can affect your organic certification. Here's one about how county mosquito spraying would be dealt with as an input.
That's a really good question. And it's not just urban areas that have dealt with mosquito spraying. I know that many areas in the South have dealt with mosquito spraying. And you would need to have buffers in place to prevent contamination from the materials that are used for mosquito spraying. And your certifier would be evaluating your plan for preventing contamination from the mosquito sprays. And there could be buffers in place. You could also contact the whatever agency is doing the mosquito spraying, let them know that you are organic or that you're applying for organic certification, and that they should not spray in the vicinity of your farm. Now, this is something that gets into the accidental contamination realm, and there's the National Organic Program, the regulation and the Organic System Plan, it is process-based. It's not entirely testing-based. It's really based on your process of production and the methods that you use, and not just testing the end product. However, if there was an instance where a farm had an organic system plan, it was certified, it was approved, and they had a method in there for preventing contamination from from mosquito spraying, but say they had an agreement with the county to not spray, but they got sprayed anyway, what would probably happen is that the certifier would send out an inspector, and the inspector would take a sample of the crops that were sprayed and send that in for testing. And what the regulation says, they do acknowledge that there's contaminants out there in the environment, and the testing says that, the regulation says that when crops are tested for contamination, they can have up to 5% of the EPA's tolerance limit for that specific pesticide on that specific crop. So the certifier will need to know what was sprayed, and they'll look at what the active ingredients were in that, and then do a testing to see if there's any residue of that. And if there is 5% or more of the EPA's tolerance level for that pesticide on the specific crop, then that crop won't be able to be sold as organic.
Okay, yeah, here's another question about buffers. Whether urban farms can become organic and how far barriers like roads can be from crops.
Yes, urban farms can absolutely become organic, and the barriers such as buffers between things such as roads is really dependent on what the risks are. Some of the risks coming from roads might be runoff from roads, but that would be true of all farms. And usually the buffer doesn't need to be that big from a road. Maybe just a standard what is the berm of the road is usually sufficient to prevent contamination from cars driving on the road. However, one thing to keep in mind is if there's a risk that the city or the county is spraying herbicides along that road, there would need to be a bigger buffer. Most of the time, a 25-foot to 50-foot buffer is going to be appropriate depending on the slope of the land, if there's vegetation or if there's bare ground in that buffer. Like I said in the presentation, the buffers are really site-specific, but yes, there can be organic farms in urban areas, and you would want to check with a certifier you're working with if you're unsure about what specific buffer is needed for your situation and how big of a buffer is appropriate. Just check with the certifier about that.
Okay, here's a question about record keeping related to seeds. My organic certifier has asked that I keep a record of the seeds we use, either in numbers or poundage. Is there a good resource for the weight of seeds or a shortcut you can think of to help us get through this tedious bit of record keeping?
That's not something that I am familiar with. Usually the seed weight is on the package of the seeds that you purchase, but I'm not familiar with keeping records specific to the weight or the poundage of the seeds that are used. I would just go with the weight on the package of seeds.
I'm just thinking maybe the Organic Seed Alliance might be a good resource to find
right,
out more about that as well.
Absolutely.
You might want to ask them. Or you could type it in to Ask an Expert, and we can help you find an answer from our seed experts. Let's see. At what level must erosion be controlled, or soil loss tolerance? 10 tons? There's a reference to the NOP 205-205D is not specific. Do all forms of erosion have to be controlled? Sheet and rill as well as gully erosion? So, erosion question.
What the regulation wants is to have organic production in place to minimize erosion. It doesn't specify the type of erosion, but what it really wants to prevent is the loss of topsoil through erosion, and this could be done through cover crops as a way to prevent erosion. I'm sorry I don't have a more specific answer to your question. I would check with your certifier about the specifics of your operation and the type of erosion that's being experienced on your operation. Again, maybe ask an expert, so an expert about erosion that could help you come up with ways to minimize erosion on your operation. The organic regulation doesn't quantify or measure erosion and how much erosion is happening, but they do want to see that you don't have a lot of bare soil that would be subject to erosion, and that the direction of your tillage isn't contributing to erosion. But again, the Ask an Expert would be a great place to ask additional questions on that, or contact NRCS that are specifics with soil conservation. I'm sorry I don't have a more specific answer to that.
Okay, we just got a comment about seeds. Thank you very much for this. It says the packet has either the weight or the number of seeds. So if anybody else has any questions, I think we've asked all the ones that have come in, so we'll just give, oh wait, here's another one coming in, but yeah, we still have a few more minutes, so if people have more questions, feel free to type them in. What about tissue culture planting material? People comment on that.
Can you be a little more specific?
Yeah, if you could maybe ask a more specific question about what you mean about tissue culture planting material. In the meantime, I'll ask the next question. Would a specific field be considered organic if chlorination was used to purify the water?
That depends. The safe drinking water and chlorination up to the levels allowed in the Safe Drinking Water Act are allowed in organic production, both in irrigation water and in water that's used post-harvest. Post-harvest, you can use chlorine at levels higher than the Safe Drinking Water Act for sanitation purposes. However, the water would need to be diluted at rinse to bring it to Safe Drinking Water Act levels, which is 4 parts per million of chlorine after the sanitation process. But the chlorine can be used in irrigation water so long as that it is compliant with the Safe Drinking Water Act. It shouldn't exceed it.
Okay, here's a more specific question. If it's okay to use planting material from tissue culture in organic farms, for example, vegetable seedlings that were developed in labs by tissue culture but not genetically modified organisms.
Vegetable seedlings would need to be, any type of seedling that you're using would need to come from a certified organic operation. So if it was developed in a lab, that lab would have to be certified. However, if you are growing something from, say, a perennial planting stock that doesn't come from a seed, then, and I'll give examples of that, would be things like asparagus, sweet potatoes, those types of things. They're treated similar to seeds where you would have to use organic if it's available, and if it's not available, you would have to use untreated planting stock. I have never come across vegetable seedlings that would normally come from a seed coming from a tissue culture. And I'm not familiar with the practices of producing seedlings from tissue culture and whether those practices would be compliant with organics or not. But any type of seedling that you're using, if it's a seedling where typically that plant, say a pepper plant or eggplant, that crop would have to come from a certified organic plant.
Yeah, I guess she's talking about perennials.
Perennials, it would depend on the production practices. So perennials would need to be untreated. So if you're potatoes, for example, if you're planting potatoes, then the potato planting stock can't be treated with prohibited synthetic fungicides, pesticides, anything like that. So the same would be true of any perennial that is produced from tissues coming out of a lab. It would have to be untreated.
Okay, thanks. Here's one more question. Do plant materials, seeds, and plants have to be from organic sources for buffers planted to perennial vegetation?
No. Now, the inputs are never certified organic. So like a fertilizer wouldn't be certified organic. The fertilizers would just be allowed in organic production, and some people that can be really confusing, but the fertilizer itself isn't a crop, but you would have to use organic allowed fertilizers in the buffer zone, because remember, the buffer zone is preventing contamination of prohibited materials from coming onto your organic land. So if you have a neighboring farm, that buffer zone is essentially used to catch any runoff, for example, runoff of synthetic fertilizers or pesticides. So you could not use synthetic fertilizers or synthetic pesticides in the buffer zone. You could use GMO crops in the buffer zone, but since the crop itself is not being represented as organic, you wouldn't need to use certified organic seeds in the buffer zone because that crop is not actually going to produce an organic crop.
Okay. Here's another farmer question. Our farm grows crops for market and also has some small gardens of not for market vegetables that are also organic. Do we need to account for these home garden crops and the inputs in our applications and records?
If the area where the gardens are, you want it to be part of the area that you're seeking certification for, then yes, it would need to be included in your organic system plan and in your records, both your input application records and your harvest records. However, if the gardens are just for personal use and don't need to be certified for marketing purposes, you're not representing them as organic when you sell them, then it doesn't need to be included in your organic system plan in your application. However, just for clarification purposes, it's always a good idea to explain that you have a garden on your premises that you're using for personal use and that's not requested for certification. And one thing is that I've seen with folks that are gardening that is separate from the marketing aspect of their farm is if they're using different inputs, the certifier might ask for information on those inputs and information on that garden just to confirm that that if they see inputs that aren't allowed in organic production on your farm, that they can trace that to use in the garden as opposed to use on the farm, and they might request additional information on that. But it only needs to be included in the application if you're planning on that area, that land being certified. And that's again, you know, it's very specific to your operation, and it's a good idea to check with your individual certifier for how much information they want on any areas in or adjacent to your farm that aren't included in the organic system plan.
Okay, thank you. We're just about out of time, and I'd like to thank everyone for their questions and mention once again that you can find our many other recorded presentations on organic farming topics at the link on your screen.